Good evening, ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties. This is Alex, coming at you from the underworld, and welcome back to another episode of... This weekend, I'm reviewing The Final Gate by Wesley Southard and Lucas Mangum. And before I get started, I would just like to note that this book is available in print, ebook, and Audible. Which, between those options, I chose the audiobook. And I would just like to take this opportunity to compliment the narrator, Sean C. Duriger, for giving a great performance while he read this, especially when it came down to his diverse voice acting, because the way he was able to alter his voice, it truly brought the characters of this book to life for me. Also, I would like to add that I buddy read this with my good online friend Hanny, which, as always, we had a great time discussing the characters and speculating about what would happen next. But up until this book, Hanny had never dove into the world of Lucio Fulci. So after our read, she watched a few of his classics, and needless to say, she is a Fulci fan now. But even though this book does resurrect the Fulci classics like The House by the Cemetery, The Beyond, Zombie, and The Gates of Hell, also known as City of the Living Dead, you do not have to be familiar with those movies in order to enjoy this book. However, since I grew up being a huge fan of those movies, when I read this book, I truly felt like the authors did a superb job in channeling Fulci's spirit into their work. And as a side note, since this book ended up putting me in the mood, I threw myself a marathon of the movies that I had just listed. And not only was this a fun trip down memory lane, but it allowed me to really see that this book could have easily been a sequel to any of those films. But without me rambling on anymore, let's go visit the children at St. Luke's and see what fresh hell awaits us. The Final Gate by Wesley Southard and Lucas Mangum takes place in an old countryside children's shelter, where a young boy named Bryce has fallen victim to supernatural forces. And even though Bryce's older brother Brandon is unaware of what's happened, he's decided it's time to take guardianship over Bryce. However, once he arrives at St. Luke's, he learns from the caregivers that Bryce has been adopted and they can't share any information. From here, Brandon hires a private detective and does some sleuthing on his own, which this leads to quite a few twists and turns. Meanwhile, as the plot thickens, a forbidden book called The Seven Evil Spirits comes into play, which eventually it's revealed that there are 7 gateways in this world that lead to hell. And even though multiple gateways had been opened up 40 years ago, another gateway is soon to open at St. Luke's. Now, to prevent all hell from breaking loose, it's up to 2 unlikely strangers to come together so they can seal this gate before it's too late. For this episode, I was able to ask Wesley Southard and Lucas Mangum some questions in regards to how this book came to be. So sit back and enjoy their answers. Question number 1. How did The Final Gate come to be? Lucas. The Final Gate came about when Brian Smith, author of 68 Kill and Kill for Satan, posted a question on Facebook asking what movies his writer friends would most like to write novelizations of. Wes answered with Gates of Hell, also known as City of the Living Dead, and I answered with The Beyond. I took things a little further and said I always wanted to write a book set in the world of Lucio Fulci's Gates of Hell movies. In The Beyond, it said there are 7 gates, but we only got to see the stories for 3 of them, if you count House by the Cemetery. Not long after, Wes messaged me and said he couldn't stop thinking about that idea, then asked if I would like to collaborate with him on something like this. Wes: Yep, pretty much exactly the way Lucas described it. The whole thing started out as a bit of a pipe dream, but as I sat and thought about it, I realized, why let this be a fantasy? Just do it. What's going to happen? Either people will love it or hate it. Thankfully, the general consensus with the end result has been pretty positive. Question number 2. What was it like collaborating on the final gate together? For example, how was plotting determined? Who decided what to write? Who decided what characters to flesh out? Lucas. The collaboration process was pretty seamless with Wes. We had a Skype call about the direction we would like the story to go, and then just took turns writing a few thousand words at a time. We communicated a lot along the way, and around the halfway point, we each read what we had done so far and made list of everything we set up so we'd know what we had to pay off by the book's end. Wes. Lucas was a dream to work with. Our styles matched up so well, which made the editing process a breeze. You never know what it's going to be like when you're trying to blend both voices into one seamless style when you're deep in the subsequent drafts. But it ended up being so easy and painless. Anytime either of us had any issues, they were resolved quickly and without any egos being bruised. Question number 3. The final gate felt like Fulci was still alive and creating. How were the two of you able to achieve writing a book that honored his work this well? Lucas. Man, I really appreciate you saying that, because Wes and I are such a fan of his Gates of Hell movies as well as Zombie, we already had a clear vision of what we wanted. We talked about what made those movies unique and memorable, and tried to imitate that in prose form. After Wes sent me the first chapter, I knew would work well together on this because he made the zombies extra gooey. Anyone who's a fan of those movies knows Fulci's undead excrete a lot of fluid. Wes. I'm a die-hard Fulci fan, so honestly, it wasn't as hard as I thought it would be to replicate that style into prose. Fulci, for all of his faults, had a lot of things that made his work unique. He's known for his signature movies, that is eye trauma, zombies, animal attacks, lots of fluids, a ton of wriggling bugs, etc. But there are little things that we also had to make sure we implemented into our book that made it much more than just a bunch of copies of what came before. Things like long bouts of characters staring at one another, the wind picking up at certain moments, picking out when to utilize a jump scare on the page, misspelled wall signs. If you've seen those films as many times as we have, you begin to pick up all the nuances of Fulci's style and what made his films so great. Question number 4. What advice do you have for other authors who are wanting to co-author a book? Lucas. I think a tribute to an existing work is a great place to start on collaborations. The hardest part of collaborating is finding a unified voice. But if you're working in the style of something you're both fans of, the shared vision is already in place. It was that way for The Final Gate and Pandemonium as well, which I co-wrote with Ryan Harding. That pays tribute to the Argento Bava Demon movies and pro wrestling. Without a pre-existing shared vision, though, there's going to be a lot of back and forth as you work to get that unified voice. Wes. Honestly, I think being friends with the other person first is probably the most beneficial thing. I've co-written 4 different projects at this point, and I was already friends with all of them before we decided to collaborate. Communication is absolutely key when writing a book with someone. If you already know that person well enough, it makes it easier to approach them with new ideas and changes you'd like to see, as opposed to being nervous about getting your voice heard. Question number 5. How can readers contact you? Lucas. While I'm on Twitter and Facebook, I take a lot of breaks from those platforms for mental health reasons, so the best way to keep up with me is to sign up for my newsletter at lucasmangum@substack.com. I'm pretty good about responding to comments. Wes. I'm pretty easy to find all across all social media. Wesley Southard on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Now that we have that covered, I would just like to thank Wesley Southard and Lucas Mangum for providing me with those answers. I understand that they both have a very busy schedule, so I really appreciate the time that they took with me. But now it's time that we move on to the spoiler section of this video. And if you haven't read this book before, I'm about to reveal some things that could ruin the experience for you. So if you would like to click away, all you have to do is scroll down to the comments and you'll see that there's a pinned comment at the top with the timestamp in it. Once you click that timestamp, it will direct you away from the spoilers and bring you to the thoughts section. Now, you only have 17 seconds to do this, so ready, set, go! Since everyone's had the opportunity to click away, I would like to talk about a few of my favorite moments. First up is the opening sequence where Bryce and Robert get attacked. Now, leading up to this, the creep factor begins late at night where Bryce is alone in his bedroom at St. Luke's and he can't sleep. Then, as the hours start to pass, he realizes that he's actually not alone whatsoever. Instead, his old roommate Jake, who had supposedly been adopted, is in the room with him, and he's been turned into a zombie. So, after Jake attacks, Bryce tries to run to safety, but in the process, he's grabbed by a zombie that's been hiding under his bed. Even still, he's able to break free and get to the closet where he's hoping to take shelter. But once he opens the closet door, multiple hands shoot out from the darkness and grab him. Then, while the handyman Robert is outside, he hears screams coming from inside the house. So after he goes to investigate, he discovers that Bryce has been converted into a zombie. But before Bryce can attack him, someone stabs Robert in the neck, then his eyes are pulled out by a horde of dead children. Aside from how we're presented with these folky type of zombies that are described as these eye-bleeding monstrosities that ooze nothing but pus and bile, everything about this buildup was pure nightmare fuel. And because of the vibe that I got from the location, it honestly felt like I was watching an old folky movie. Also, this whole sequence took me out of my comfort zone because I truly believed Bryce was going to be the survivor of the story. Like, I honestly thought someone was going to eventually find him and rescue him, but no, the authors pull a Hitchcock and kill him off in just a few pages. Then, after being hit with that, I was introduced to Robert, and I thought to myself, okay, well, maybe he is going to be a lead in some way, but no, he gets killed off. So, after this happening back to back, I realized I was reading a book where anything could happen to anyone. My next favorite moment was when Annie's dad and grandparents were killed. Which, leading up to this, Annie's grandparents, Kay and Fred, had caused a ruckus with St. Luke's administrator, Kurt. And because of how Kay acted, he decides that this is a good time to stop their supervised visits. However, this doesn't stop Kay and Fred from concocting a plan with their son Edgar, who has had trouble with the law and was deemed as an unfit parent. And even though Kay does get cold feet on the night that they're supposed to break Annie out, Edgar forces her to continue forward with their plan. And to make sure all bases are covered, Edgar has Fred hide in the woods behind St. Luke's, where he is to be a lookout. Yet, while Fred is walking through the woods, he gets ambushed by a group of zombie children. And since Kay and Edgar are oblivious to this, they continue forward where Edgar runs around the back of St. Luke's, while Kay is simply able to walk through the unlocked front door. But once she arrives at the level where the children are sleeping, she is confronted by a dead man who has bugs just pouring out of his mouth. Then, out of nowhere, she trips and falls, and she gets ripped apart by pigs and sheep. Okay, so I knew these asshats were gonna die because, for starters, they were absolutely horrible people, and secondly, they were sloppy. Even still, I didn't know exactly how their deaths would be executed. But what really sold this sequence for me was when the animals attacked Kay. Because one thing I really loved about Fulci's The Beyond was how it insinuated that animals and insects were instigated by the evil. So to see this scene come out of nowhere, it really excited me and it satisfied my bloodthirst. My final favorite moment was when all hell broke loose. Now, this comes about because after Jillian went looking for Brandon, she gets approached by this older man named Claudio, and he explains to her that the gates of hell are about to open up at St. Luke's, and he knows why she's here. Which, at first, she's a little apprehensive, but after she listens to him, she discovers that he makes a lot of sense. And because the police aren't going to do anything to help them, he explains that this is all up to them, and he presents to her this key that is filled with the blood of the saints, which it's this blood that they are supposed to use to close and seal the gateway. After that, Jillian and Claudio confront Kurt, and at first he dismisses what they say, but after he looks over his paperwork, he discovers that the Children of St. Luke has been signed out by the owner, who doesn't actually have the authority to do this. Meanwhile, one of the workers of St. Luke's by the name of Miss Myra has lured Annie down into the basement, which at this point Annie is the last child left alive. Also, this is when we discover that the owner of St. Luke's has been dead and Miss Myra has been forging his signature. Then, after Jillian, Claudio, and Kurt run to St. Luke's to save the day, Kurt dies because of an imploding window. Then Jillian and Claudio go into the basement where they discover that the gates of hell have opened up, and at the entrance is Miss Myra standing over Annie, who she intends to sacrifice. However, after a brief scuffle, the spirit beyond the gates grabs Miss Myra and pulls her into the hellfire, which this gives Jillian just enough time to grab Annie and haul ass. And even though Jillian and Annie are able to get out of St. Luke's and drive a nice little distance away, shortly thereafter, Jillian discovers that she has to return to St. Luke's to close the gate because as long as it's open, it's causing utter chaos in our world. This ending was so badass. Like, everything about it, from its scenery to its kills, was nothing but pure Fulci. And what I love so much about its action, suspense, and gore was these authors know what fans of Fulci expect. And throughout this book, especially the ending, they totally delivered. Also, I really felt like the ending was so intense and I was so invested in everything that was going on that all of my obligations were put on the back burner until this book ended. I would like to take this opportunity to bitch about Dan. Now, I understand that Myra and Lionel aren't saints whatsoever because they've been sacrificing children so the gates of hell will open up. But Dan has this personality that I've seen a million times before in life, and the moment that he skanked his way onto page, I said to myself, there is the friggin' dildo that's going to be the pain in everybody's ass. Like, throughout the book, I really feel like he could have redeemed himself, but he was way too self-absorbed and arrogant. Like, being a private detective, I think he could have done a whole hell of a lot more to help the kids at St. Luke, and also help Jillian and Brandon. Also, another thing that really got under my skin was how he spoke to Jillian and Brandon. Like, he would make these digs while saying things like Jillian was my girl, when Jillian is no longer with his sorry ass, and Jillian is now Brandon's girl. So, yeah, I totally wanted to slap the hell out of him for that. But at the very least, at the end of this book, when he finally gets eaten by a zombie dog, I was like, yes, this arrogant, cocky asshole has finally gotten smoked. The Final Gate by Wesley Southard and Lucas Mangum was a great throwback to Fulci. And because of what happens in this book with its characters, setting, style, and even its kills, these authors totally know what the Fulci fandom expects, and they deliver. Also, Hanny and I noticed where this book focused on bullying, the repercussions of toxic families, children falling in between the cracks, and it even paid homage to the Satanic Panic. Character-wise, the villains in this book were a lot of fun because they felt empowered, they felt cunning, and under their candy coating, they were truly monsters. Also, every time I thought I knew who the hero or heroine was going to be, a simple twist of fate changed everything and left me thinking, WTF, where do we go from here? But once I found out who the heroine was going to be, I was really happy about that because she had a big heart to her and she really stuck her neck out a lot. So, because of everything she went through, I feel like the authors truly provided us with a great final girl. Theme-wise, bullying is prominent throughout this work, especially when it comes down to what the children characters go through like Donnie and Annie. But as I've said a million times before in previous videos regarding the subject, bullying is something that doesn't just happen to children, it happens to adults as well. And between childhood and adulthood, it changes its face, and adults learn how to mask it better. So, with that in mind, as I was reading about the character Dan, I saw where he totally fit into that category of being a bully, especially by how he treated Brandon and Jillian's relationship. And if I compared the children to the adults in this circumstance, I noticed where the type of bullying that the children did was sloppy and it was easy to catch, mostly because it was hands-on. However, with the adults, it's a little bit harder to pick out because they're sly about it, and it comes across in the form of underhanded comments. Next up is the subject of toxic families and their repercussions, which this is greatly seen when Annie's grandparents decide to break the law so they can reunite her with her father, who comes across as being extremely physically and verbally abusive. Not to mention he's surrounded by drugs and drug addicts, all of which made Annie feel pretty uncomfortable. Also, the book does explain that Annie's grandparents had bailed their son out of jail every time he got in trouble, which this showed me how enabling a toxic person only leads to more negative traits. And had they not always bailed him out when he got in trouble, he might not have become the character that we saw in this book, and they might have custody of Annie. Then, as far as children falling between the cracks is concerned, I think this book does a pretty good job of showing us how even though a child is at a children's shelter, it doesn't mean that child is safe, which I've already covered the topic of being bullied. But under extreme circumstances like what we see in this book, I get the impression that some children can go from one traumatic experience to the next, to the next, and to the next. And even though there are some children who do find a happy ending with a happy family, there are still quite a few children who aren't so fortunate. Also, because of what happens at St. Luke's with the occult activity, I felt like this was a good nod for the satanic panic propaganda that floated around in the 80s and 90s, where childcare facilities were falsely accused for using children in satanic ritual abuse. Which, it kind of makes sense to me why the authors would focus on this, because a majority of Fulci's supernatural horror took place during that time. As a side note, I really liked how the authors took time and gave a nod to the death metal group Necrophagia, as Fulci's movies had inspired some of their music. Plus, I thought it was really cool how one of the children characters was named Annie. And because of this choice, it made me think about what would happen if Little Orphan Annie stepped into a folky movie, which I'm not certain that was intentional or not, but it's totally where my mind went, and I interpreted that as being just a little bit of dark humor. So, yeah, that was a lot of fun. Overall, there were actually quite a few scary moments in this book, and there were a few times that I didn't feel safe reading this at night, which the main reason why is because the setting takes place in an old house in the woods, and even though I don't live in an old house, I live in the middle of nowhere in the woods. So these authors totally knew how to utilize those vibes of being in the middle of nowhere. Also, there were quite a few creepy moments, and there were a few scenes that were really gross out moments. But even though these were gross out moments, they weren't extreme moments. So if you haven't really gotten into splatterpunk quite yet, this would be a good starter book. The Final Gate by Wesley Southard and Lucas Mangum was a great throwback to 80s style horror, and Hanny and I could not put this down. Also, because of the way this was constructed, it really filled me with nostalgic vibes, and it made me feel like I was walking the aisles at Blockbuster trying to find that next grisly classic to take home with me on a Friday night. And, of course, this would be that grisly classic. So, at the end of the day, if you are looking for a splatterpunk book that will fill you with the nostalgic vibes and make you feel like Folky is still alive and well, then I highly recommend The Final Gate. Now that it's time to close out the video, I would like to thank these amazing people for contributing to my Patreon account. As you can tell, some of the names listed here are creators, so be sure to check out their work. And if you would like to contribute to my Patreon account as well, I have a link available in the description section of this episode, where for $5 a month, I'll give you a shout out at the end of my videos. And if there is a specific profession you would like for me to tie to your name, just let me know and I'll include that as well. Also, I do have a $10 tier available, which you will still receive the shout out that you see here at the end of my videos, but I do creepy photography on the side, so at the beginning of every month, I'll send you over a creepy photo. From there, you can print it off, do whatever you like with it, it's yours to own. If you are able to do this, that's great. If not, no sweat. I just hope you return to this channel so we can have a good time together. Also, links to my Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok are all available in the description section of this episode. And if you would like to spoil me, a link to my Amazon wish list is in there as well. And if you have not subscribed to this channel, be sure to subscribe and click that notifications bell because I have more book reviews coming in the near future. So until we see each other again, I hope everyone has a great week and sweet nightmares.